We are continuing to work through the book of Job. And so far, I think we made it through 12 verses last week, and we'll make it through maybe about the same or a little bit more this week. But I wanted to start with simply a reminder that you're gonna miss a class or two or three, and that's okay. Come back. This is not the kind of class that's going to have to build on itself where you have to have perfect attendance in order to make sense of every single lesson. Sometimes I feel like if you miss a class, people are like, well, I missed that class, so I'm done for the rest of the semester. Don't feel that way. If you miss a class, come on back. A lot of what we'll do at the beginning of the class sessions is kind of frame what we're talking about so we can make sense of where we are in the book. The more that we repeat it, and the more that I repeat it, the easier it is to understand, and the more that I learn it, which, it's really what it's all about. Okay, so we're going to start off with some review from last week. These are some of the questions that we talked through last week. And one of the questions that's really important is that Job is from the land of Uz. So why is Uz important in the story? Why is Uz important? This is review from last week. Yes, we know that it's outside the land of Israel. Outside the land of Israel. And Rhonda Heiler asked, how do we know it's outside the land of Israel? And I didn't have an immediately good answer for her. I wasn't satisfied with my answer. So I was thinking about it this week, and I came up with a better answer. So she's not here, so we'll just have to tell her that it was a really good answer next time we see her. One of the things that we know that Uz is never mentioned is as part of the land of Israel. And so that's one important thing to note. The other thing is that Job's name is not a Hebrew name. And so that's important. It indicates that this is not inside the land of Israel. And then it also says that Job was greater than all the men of the east in like verse 1 or verse 2. Which means east of the land of Israel, which is why we think it's kind of set in Moab or Edom or somewhere like that. So it would kind of be like saying, I don't know if this is a city, right, or even a person's name, but if I were to say something like, this is the story of Pei from the city of Shenzhen. When you're like, well, how do you know that's not in America? Do you know every city in America? You're like, well, no, but the name is not a traditionally American name, and the city is not a traditionally American city name. You're like, well, maybe there's a Shenzhen in America. Well, maybe there is, but it seems like if an author starts off a story and says, this is the story of Pei from the region of Shenzhen, that we're gonna kind of go, okay, this is not set in America. And that's important. That's just important because it's not in the land of Israel. And why does it matter that Uz is not in the land of Israel? Why does it matter for the question that we're going to ask about the book of Job? Yes? Oh, beautiful. One reason is that it shows that God can have a relationship with people that aren't descendants from Abraham, that are not direct descendants from Abraham. Absolutely. Job is one of those great missionary books in the Old Testament where it does show that God can have a relationship with non-Israelite people. Wonderful. Good. What's another reason? Job could kind of cheat, right? Because at one point, and what do I mean when I say that? That Job could cheat if he were an Israelite when he's answering the question that he faces. Yep, Craig? Yeah, that's right. So if Job's big question, of course, is, God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? That's his question that he's going to have for God about all of his suffering. God, why are you letting this happen? And if he were an Israelite, he could cheat a little bit on the answer, and he could say, well, I'm part of God's chosen people, and while my life may be hard, ultimately I'm part of a story and part of God's people that's going to be really, really great. And that makes up for it in some sense, right? Just like the people of Israel are in slavery in Egypt for 400 years. They didn't do anything wrong, right? They go down there because there was a famine. Joseph had a famine, so they go down there. They don't do anything wrong, but nevertheless, they're enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. But they could look and go, yeah, but we've received the promises to Abraham. Ultimately, we know everything is going to work out for us and for our descendants. But Job doesn't get to cheat, right? Job doesn't get to answer that question that way. For Job, the question is, what about me? What about my personal, particular, individual case? Why does this suffering happen? Which is the whole point of the book. So I'm not going to give you that answer right now. Why would you come back for the next 10 weeks if I tell you now? So how does the Bible describe Job? We talked about this last week, first couple verses. What are some of the ways the Bible describes Job? Karen? Faithful, blameless, upright, fears God, and shuns evil. This is the narrator, right? This is just telling us who Job is. So why is that important? What does this tell us, hint for us, about how Job is going to act throughout this story? He's going to trust God. Job is blameless and upright, right? That's what verse 1 and 2 says. Blameless and upright people, people who are blameless and upright, do blameless and upright things. If you're blameless and upright, you can't help but to act blamelessly and uprightly, right? So I asked this question last time. I said, so based on just these two verses, do we know how Job is going to come through the test? We do. We already know the answer. The question for us is not, oh goodness, is Job going to be faithful or is he not? We already know Job is going to be faithful. The question is, how is he going to be faithful? So that's going to be what we'll work through a little bit. And then we talked about the wager between God and the Satan. We talked about the Satan last time, that it's more a title than a name, though I think that this is referring to Satan, but here it's just referring to the adversary. But who can describe for us what the wager is? What are the terms of the wager? Yes, and change, so that if you remove Job's blessings, he'll change. And Matt, change how? What would Job do? Not trusting God. Good. And what is it? And specifically, the Satan says something very specific. Satan will do what? Curse God to his faith, not being faithful. If you remove all of Job's blessings, the excess that you have given him, he will curse you. This is what the Satan charges. So that's the terms of the wager. Right? The Satan says, you have given Job excessive amounts of property, excessive wealth, and if you remove the excess, he's going to curse you to your face. And God, more or less, says, let's roll the dice. But of course, for God, it's not rolling the dice. God already knows how it's going to turn out because Job is blameless. Okay, so who or what is on trial in the book of Job? One of them is Job, right? We know that Job is on trial. If Job is faithful and continues to maintain his right relationship with God, even losing all of his reasons for being faithful, then Job is proven righteous. But there's someone else that's on trial here in this book. Who is it? God. God is on trial in a sense, right? Because the Satan kind of has two charges. He says there's two things that are the problem here. One, God, is that you have bad policy. Your policy is such that you give all of this wealth to people in order to buy their allegiance. So Satan is mad at God or charging God with wrong. And he's also charging Satan, Satan is also charging Job. So he says, God, you have a bad policy because you're trying to buy people's faithfulness. And Job, you're someone whose faithfulness has been bought. It's not genuine. Okay, so we got to keep both of these in mind here as we move through the book. Okay, so those are kind of a review from last week. Let's see here. Yeah, so on your handout, you can still see we have some of the texts here. And I just want to work through some of these questions together. So the first question is, what is the Satan, or Satan's, charge to God in verses 9 and 10? He says, does Job fear God for nothing? Does he love you without a cause? That's kind of the question. Does he love you even if there's no reason to love you? Even if there's no blessings in his life, even if you haven't given him anything good, would he still love you? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You've blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Okay, so I want to stop here for just a second. We just talked about the charge. But so he says that God's put a hedge around Job. How would Satan know this? Yes, I think that that's right. The answer was Satan tried to get through the hedge. It seems like there's a bit of a very intentional dialogue that's going on between God and Satan, where God knows the answers to the questions he's asking. But we, as we read it, are kind of realizing along and along more and more just what actually is going on beneath the surface, right? So the dialogue starts, and God, there's this grand meeting, and the sons of God, the heavenly beings, are coming in, and also the Satan, which like he belongs and he doesn't belong. Also the Satan. He's not included, but anyway, so he's there. And then God starts the story, starts asking him the question. He says, and God says to Satan, where have you come from? God initiates the conversation, and Satan kind of gives a little bit of a cagey answer. He doesn't actually answer the question of where he came from, but instead just what he was doing. I was walking to and fro on the earth. But now we kind of come to it, and it says later on we realize there's a hedge around Job, and we go, oh, wait a minute, Satan. Where did you come from? It seems as if Satan in some way had tried to already curse Job and bring about Job's ruin, but was prevented from doing so because he ran into this hedge that God has around Job, which is really, really interesting. So then all of a sudden the questions between Job or between Satan and God really take on a lot different meaning, a lot more significant meaning. When God asked Satan, so have you considered my servant Job, how there's no one righteous like him in all the earth? All of a sudden we start going, God, you silly. Of course God knew that Satan knew that who Job was. He wasn't asking a question to seek information. He was asking a question, I would argue, for Satan's own benefit if Satan were willing to accept it, right? Because if Satan were able to admit, even to himself, that there is righteousness, and Job is righteous, it at least prevents Satan from becoming worse than he is, and may even could lead to some sort of reconciliation. But of course, Satan doesn't do this, right? He just continues further and further and further down the rabbit trail. And so God asked Satan, where have you been? Knowing where Satan has been. And then he asks him, have you considered my servant Job? God is the one who brings him up. And Satan goes, good. I'm glad you bring up that Job guy. I've been meaning to talk to you about him. It seems that you have a really bad policy because you've set up this force field around him, this hedge of protection. How many of us have ever prayed that prayer? Pray for a hedge of protection, traveling mercies, that comes from Job with this hedge. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Now, this is again interesting. What Satan has accused God of, or Job of, is said, you have excessive wealth, and that's the problem, is the excess. So in order for that test to be valid, all that would need to happen is for Job's extra wealth to be taken away. But what is it that Satan wants to do? Does he say, I just want to take away all the extra that Job has been given? No, he wants Job's complete ruin, just like the scoundrel that he is, right? This isn't a good faith wager. Satan only has destruction in mind. Take and strike everything that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Okay, so what does the Satan want? He wants to destroy everything. I already gave you that answer. And then, so what does God agree to? So Yahweh says to Satan, very well, everything he has is in your power, which is actually a really good translation. Way to go, NIV. But on the man himself, do not lay a finger. And so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, right? And so the scene is kind of like if we're watching the drama unfold, the curtain kind of falls there. That's the end of one of the scenes. So Satan wants to completely destroy Job, but God gives him a limit, but an intentional limit. And God says, okay, very well. It's as if, the way I kind of think about it, this hedge, imagine that you had like some airtight cube underwater, okay? So there's no water that's inside this cube. You're holding it down underwater, right? The airtight cube is like the hedge, okay? Nothing can get through it. It's safe. It's dry in there. The cube is the hedge of protection that God has placed around Job. And the water is like chaos. Okay, it's the evil and wickedness and death in the world. And so it's always trying to get in to into that hedge, right? Satan is trying to get that water through that hedge. But of course, with an airtight cube, God says, no, the chaos is all set aside, it's set apart, it's not going to get in, you're protected. And what God is doing is he's saying, I'm going to open a hatch on the cube so that all of a sudden the chaos and the evil and the wretchedness of the world is now going to be rushing into Job's life. But even with that, God says, well, I'm going to leave a little part of the cube within the cube that's still safe, right? Job's life itself. But that's the way I kind of think about it, because this is what God has said. He says, I'm not going to do these things to Job, but I am letting you do them to Job. And this may seem really picky, but it's important for us when we're thinking about God that we talk rightly about how God relates to our sufferings and things. And there is a sense in which God is the cause of everything, right? We even have philosophy terms for that. He's the first cause, primary cause, blah, blah, blah. But in Job, it's as if God goes out of the way to say, I'm not the one that's actually going to do it, right? I'm not making the water rush in. I'm just removing the hedge. I'm allowing the water to come in. I'm making it possible where the water comes in. I know the water will rush in because that's what water does, but I'm not the one that's actually going to make the chaos unfold in Job's life. For me, when I think about God and the way that he relates to suffering, and I look at Job, this is a really important point for me biblically, one of those key texts that I go to when I kind of think, how does God relate to suffering in the world? He allows it, but he does not cause it. And I think that's important for me when I'm thinking through some of this Job stuff. So I want to go for a couple more minutes, then I'll ask questions, because we could stop there and ask questions for, 6 or 7 hours. And then, okay, so what is God's attitude towards Satan here? That's just such an interesting one. This is just something to kind of, lock away. And we're going to come back to this question a little bit at the very, very end of the book. Even though Satan is never mentioned again after chapter 2, we're going to talk a little bit more about God's attitude towards Satan and how Job fits into this story. Because it seems, and this is true, right? It seems like Job is a pawn in this much larger story between God and Satan, right? Do you kind of get that impression? It's like God's trying to prove a point to Satan that God doesn't really need to prove, that he already knows is true, and he does it by causing indescribable suffering on Job. I think that you and I are supposed to wrestle with that question for the next 41 chapters. Part of the challenge in teaching Job is that we want all the answers right in chapter 1 and 2, and it's a long book. And so we just kind of have to keep wrestling with it. And here's the thing. I think that's what the book of Job is designed to do, right? It would be, God could have given us all of the answers in some just piece of paper summary sheet, right? He could have been like, you want to know why I cause suffering? There's 4 main reasons, or a combination of 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? He could have done something like that. But that's not what's good for our formation. That's not what's good for us to truly catch and to glimpse a little bit of God's nature and character and to be drawn closer to him. So part of what I want to do with this class is help us wrestle for 41 chapters, 41 more chapters on the book of Job as we ask these questions, and they become sharper and sharper and sharper and sharper. And you go, I just don't understand how God's going to put it all together. And then hopefully we get some kind of answers, and we will get some kind of answers when we get to the end. So we'll come back to this Satan question. This is just one to kind of throw in, keep in your mind. Why is God talking to Satan? Why? I suggested last week, maybe controversially, I don't hope not, that God loves Satan. Because Satan is a person. He's not a human person, but he is a person. And God loves all persons. That's another 6 or 7 hours of questions. So I'll take a grand total of 3 minutes for them. Craig? Did God create Satan? Yes. Make that point, yes. And he loves what he creates, yes. Are there any other questions or thoughts at this point? Yeah, Carrie. Yeah, so Carrie asked a great question. So saying that God allows suffering but does not cause it, what does that say about God's sovereignty or God's control over creation? And it's a great question. Trying to articulate it in that way is the way that a lot of folks in the Christian tradition try to account for both, right? To just say God does not cause suffering suggests that there's some lack of power in God, right? If that's all we said. But to say he allows it but does not cause it, tries to reconcile both. I think maybe a partial analogy is thinking of like shots for our kids, right? Or something like that, where it's like we don't, Abby has to get blood draws every 6 months for some stuff. And so she gets her blood draws. She hates it. It's a big hullabaloo. She always has to get a donut after. It's a shame. I have to take her. It's a big deal. So, we're going to get these blood draws. And it's like, I want what's going to happen in the result of those blood draws, right? The tests are important for her health, make sure her medicine is working and all of those kinds of things. So it's like, well, do you want the blood draw? Yes. Do I want the pain that's going to come from sticking the needle in her arm? No. But I am allowing that. In a very real sense, I'm allowing it. In a sense of even control, I'm allowing it, right? Because I could look at the doctor, the nurse, the phlebotomist, for those who want to know the fancy term. I could look at the phlebotomist and say, nope, we're done. I'm not going to do this. We're not doing it, right? I have a level of authority over allowing that blood draw. So by permitting it, but not causing it, but I don't cause it. I think there's some kind of an analogy there where it's like there's a similar sense in which God permits things in a very sovereign way, not in a passive way. In a very sovereign way, and to allow both of those. Yes. Yeah, that's wonderful. That God causes all things to work together for good, for the good of those who love him. A key verse for us thinking through how God and suffering relate. But good. Yes. Yeah, Paul, go ahead. Yeah.
Two questions I'd like to ask. One being is, are we assuming then that God is responsible for looking after us? Or are we responsible ourselves? And therefore, whether we causes or let something happen, he's still we're assuming he's responsible for the events. Where am I going with that? Well, see, I know you don't see what I'm trying to do. Okay, next question. Job is that the oldest book of the Bible? I mean, how did people of that age before Abraham ever get to know God? How they know God? There was no written anything. Was God speaking to every individual in his own way?
Sure. I'll answer those questions in reverse order. So the first question is, how did people in the seeming era of Job, the patriarchs or a little bit before, how did they know God? And part of that is Job the oldest book? So I want to say a couple of things. First, we don't know when the book was written. The book does not have any information in it about when it was written or who wrote it. It seems set during the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a little bit in that era. But it's important to note that a book can be set in that time period, but not be written in that time period. Right? I could write a book today about Custer's last stand. It's written today, but it's set 100 years ago. I don't know when Custer was. Don't tell my history teacher, right? And here's the important thing. That doesn't mean that the book's not true. It doesn't mean that Custer's last stand didn't happen. It just means I'm writing about it from a much later period. And if I were to write a book about Custer's last stand today, it would reflect different kinds of messages and emphasis and significance from one that was written in the immediate aftermath, right? Thinking about how Americans have treated our Native American brothers and sisters, right? Some of those sensitivities would be reflected in the book that I write today that likely would not have been reflected in the year after Custer's death. So when was it written? We don't know. So it could have been a large swath of time. And so the second question then is, how do they relate to God in that era? And again, we just don't know. The book of Job, there's a lot of questions that the book of Job is designed to answer. And there's a lot of questions that it prompts that it's not designed to answer. And that doesn't mean they're not good questions to ask. Sometimes they're really fun questions to ask. And there may even be little hints about how we answer them. But we want to primarily think, what are the questions that the book wants me to ask that it is trying to answer? And so we just don't know how God revealed himself to the people in the period of the patriarchs, or to Job specifically. We just don't know. The other question was dealing with human responsibility and God's responsibility with actions. Without getting too deep into all of the weeds, too much deeper into all the weeds, it's important for me, theologically, to be able to say that God neither wills nor causes evil of any kind. That's the phrase that I want to be able to say as the way that I put my Bible together. God doesn't will it, he doesn't want it to happen, nor does he ever cause evil of any kind. And the reason is because it starts really messing with who I think God is supposed to be if God starts wanting evil things, even for a good reason, right? So God doesn't just want bad things for a good reason. He only wants good things, because then it starts messing with my brain, right? I'm like, well, wait a minute. If God wants something that's evil, then that makes the evil good because God can only want what's good. And that would have made the good thing evil. And then I just start crying, right? So we don't want that. So I want to be able to say that God only ever wills or does good things. And so the responsibility piece is part of that question, but even with that, I don't ever, even if we're I don't even want to say, well, God, I made God do something evil, right? I'm responsible for it. I'm the one who's ultimately at fault, but God is still the one who did it. That doesn't really help me that much because God still did something evil. And then if God does evil, does it make him God? Wouldn't God be the one who didn't do it? Just, again, I start crying and we don't want to cry. Yep. One more question in the back? Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. God's justice is all part of this, right? And it's fun. The important thing is, again, see, I think this is kind of what the book of Job is meant to do. Right? It's not just about getting to the right place, but the wrestling with it, I think, is what pleases God when we're reading the book of Job. We're not just reading Job for the information. The process of reading Job forces us to think about God and his world and our place and the way we fit and the way God fits in really shaping kinds of ways. And so I think these conversations are part of what Job is meant to do to us as we read it. Okay, all right, we're going to keep moving along here. The first cycle, I think this is all new for this week. So this is on the back of page 1. I just put the Bible text up there. And this is easy. We'll move a little bit further along here. For those who are familiar with the Job story, so what happens to Job's life? God turns over everything to Satan's power that Job has, and then what happens? Disaster, right? On all levels. What are some of the things that happen? He loses what? His kids. He loses what else? Yeah, his cattle, his camels, his sheep, right? I mean, it's beautiful storytelling, right? I mean, when you read this, you just go, this is one of the best pieces of literature ever written. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house, and it reminds you, everything was good in Job's life. We already saw this language, this idea, back when, once upon a time, there was this Job, and everything was great, right? That kind of language comes back. You're like, wow, everything is good. You're reminded of Job's goodness, but we now know that when we hear of Job's goodness, there's a sense of death. Brum, brum, brum. It's kind of overlaying the music, right, as they're feasting, because we know that everything has been put into Satan's hands. But again, the storyteller, right, whoever wrote, how the story was written, you go, oh, we're talking about the sons and daughters, so they're going to be the first thing that go. But no, it's just amazing, right? So a messenger comes and says to Job, the oxen were they were eating, doing all their stuff, and the Sabaeans came. I and only I escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, right, it's as if in the story, as if in what happened, he barely finished getting those words out of his mouth when this other messenger has caught up and says, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep, and only I escaped. And while he was still speaking, the Chaldeans came. And while he was still speaking, the most terrible tragedy for Job, right, that his children, sons and daughters, were feasting and drinking when a mighty wind came, collapsed on them, and they died. Oh, just 4 successive waves of death and devastation. The chaos is into the cube. It has wrecked every part of Job's life. And at this, Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground in worship. So he didn't curse God. The text is very specific and says he worshiped God. Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. Yahweh gave, Yahweh has taken away. May the name of Yahweh be praised. And just in case, because sometimes I'm a little slow, the writer puts it in there for us so we don't miss it. Verse 22, I even underlined it. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Okay, so what happened? Job lost everything. Job's response is worship. He doesn't curse God, he blesses God. And so what's the status of the wager at this point? Who could describe it if you're going, okay, so who's winning the first hand? God. That's right. God 1, Satan 0. And here's the thing, right? At this point, the wager has technically been fulfilled, because the challenge was Job only worships you because of all the extra you've given him. Well, not only did they take away the extra, they took away everything that Job has. Satan took away everything that Job has, and Job still worships God. But the book of Job isn't over, because we're going to get round 2. It's like Satan is lashing out, just seeking any means of trying to get back in this thing and accusing Job and trying to fracture the relationship between Job and God in round 2. Okay, so Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. That's the first cycle. Any questions on the first cycle? Yeah, Nathan.
So I was reading at the top of the entire section.
That's dangerous reading. Yeah.
Says Satan takes Job's property and children. But in 21, he says, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away.
Yeah.
So is Job thinking that God is taking away and him, or that thinking that God is doing not just allowing the evil, but is he doing?
Yeah. See, reading gets you into so much trouble. Nathan, here's the thing, right? That's a great question. We can make it even sharper, right? Because in Job 42, it says, I don't have all of Job memorized. I know I'm working on it. Something along the lines of his friends and family brought him an offering, and the narrator's talking, right? The person who's authoritative, who tells us that Job is righteous. He says, because of all the evil that God did to Job. Right? And then we're going to see this in the second cycle. God doesn't pass the buck to Satan, right? He says, why did you incite me against Job for no reason? Oh, yeah. So if I were writing the Bible, I probably would have written it differently, right? Which is probably a good thing that I didn't. Yeah. So it is written as it would appear to us. And we want to say this, right? The biblical language is true, right? Like, when we deal with these kinds of issues, let me say it this way. God walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, right? Now, there's something that's very true about that statement. It's more true to say God walked with Adam and Eve in the garden in the cool of the day than to say God did not walk with Adam and Eve in the garden in the cool of the day, right? So now, does that mean that God had a body and legs and arms and nose and face like we do? No. But the biblical language is written, and it's true, and it's good, and it's communicating the truth to us. So there is something true when we say that God, in some sense, caused this evil. Now, what I want to say is the word evil in Job is not always what we mean with evil. And I want to say a second thing for your question specifically. Human speakers do not always tell the truth in the Bible. So just because Job says, the Lord is given, the Lord is taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord, does not necessarily mean that everything that Job has said is absolutely true, right? It seems to be what Job is genuinely expressing. He's not telling something he knows to be a lie. He is speaking truthfully. The Bible even calls it worshiping, and then goes on to say, that Job does not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So it actually affirms Job's words, even though it seems that Job is not as theologically precise as the Bible even suggests, right? Because God has given Job and his possessions into Satan's hand. And actually, Nathan, that actually is going to help us later on too, when we get to the end of the book of Job. So what would I say? I would want to say that Job is commended for what he says. Just because Job says something, or anybody says something in the Bible, a human character, does not mean that it's absolutely true in the same way as if God says it. And that there is a sense in which God is sovereign, superintending the situation. If it were not for God's actions, it would not have happened this way. And yet God did not cause it, is what I would want to say theologically. Y'all are asking too many good questions. Yes, Paul?
You know, with humans, it's difficult for us to understand that if God has the power to stop Satan from doing what he's going to do, if we were humans in that position where we could stop some evil person from causing harm to another, and we didn't do it, we'd be held legally responsible.
Yes.
But that,
yeah, it doesn't apply to God. And see, and we'll get there. That's a great question. And there's all kinds of resources and ideas that we can use, but we got to get to chapter 42 first. But you're exactly right. And I think we're supposed to think that at this point. Like, but wait a minute, he's God. Yeah, we're supposed to think that at this point. Yeah, Deb. So in our modern legal system, if there is some wickedness or evil being done and we could stop it, we should stop it. Otherwise, in some sense, we are held responsible for it. And so how does that, what about God? If God could have stopped the suffering from Job, doesn't that mean that he should have stopped the suffering from Job? And since he didn't, what does that mean of God? And that's exactly the right question to ask.
Isn't that the truth you just said before?
It is, but we haven't gotten there yet in Job. Like, we would want to say something like God doesn't cause it, but according to Job, we start I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm reading Job at this point, you're going, I don't know, how's this going to work out at the end? If all we read is Job 1 and 2, we are left with some questions. Okay, so what do you think? Let's take maybe a minute and just think, looking through, reviewing, what do you think is the key verse from chapter 1 and why? In the handout, I've underlined a couple of options, or maybe you think of some others. What do you think is one of the key verses and why? Sorry. 21, why? Why, Nancy? All right, so 21 is the Lord gave and the Lord taken away, but may the name of the Lord be praised.
Well, starting with naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart.
Yep.
So we have no reason to expect that we're going to have all the good stuff to take with us, you know.
Because we're not owed anything. We came into the world. Okay, so Nancy would say that the key verse is verse 21 because it gives a sense of the reason why we should not expect anything in this current life. Because we come into the world with nothing, we leave with nothing, we're not owed anything. Good, that's an option. What other ideas? 22, why, Jess? Yep. Oh. Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Key verse, chapter 1, Job passes the test, which means God passes the test. Okay, what else? What other options? There's no right answer here. That's good news. You're all passing, as long as you pick a verse, 1 through 22. Good. So Job, I think for me, DJ, that's the same thing. So DJ's that Job being a man who's blameless and upright, that's probably for me the key verse. And the reason I keep coming back to that is because a lot of times the interpreters say at some point along the way, Job goes off the rails. And there's a reason for them to say this, is because we have this tricky verse at the end of Job that's often translated, I repent and confess in dust and ashes, which suggests, if we're repenting of something, that we've done something wrong. When God comes and he speaks to Job out of the whirlwind, and he looks at him and says, gird yourself up like a man. Where were you when I formed the pedestals of the earth? Where were you when I told the sea you can go this far and no further? Answer me, surely you know, O man. Right? We'll say these kinds of things. We go, Job has said something wrong. I can tell because God's angry. And I can also tell because Job says he's repenting. So we'll have to figure out what we're going to do with those verses when we get there. But it seems to me that the book is telling us from the beginning, don't go there. This is the lens by which you understand Job. He is a man who is blameless and upright. He does not sin. So I think for me, that's the key verse because that winds up playing a lot later on in the book as well, his blamelessness and uprightness. All right, we're going to keep going here through chapter 1. So at this rate, Sunday school will be 84 weeks long. All right, so chapter 2, round 2, up in heaven, started up in heaven. So what's similar with 1:6 through 12, and what's different? If we had all the time in the world, I'd give you like 5 or 10 minutes, and I'd have both of them laid out, and I'd be like, circle the similarities, underline the differences. But we'll just have to kind of do this on the fly. It starts out exactly the same way. Even in English, the NIV missed the boat on this one. It's actually the exact same way. There was a day when the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to him, where have you come from? We should be thinking to ourselves, I have seen this before. The biblical writers are not Charles Dickens. They don't include extra details for no reason. Whenever we see repetition like this, we always should ask ourselves, why? Why is the writer choosing to repeat this? We'll keep going, though, for a second. Satan answered the Lord, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. The exact same answer. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. So far, it's like a carbon copy of the first scene. So whenever we see similarities between two biblical passages, we want to ask ourselves, why is there the repetition? And we also want to ask ourselves, what are the differences and why are the differences meaningful? Right? It's kind of like whenever there's a difference between what seems to be similar, that difference is highlighted for us. So the first main difference we get to is he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. So that's going to be important. But before we even get there, right, there's other questions. Where has Satan been in between chapter 1 and chapter 2? It says Satan says he's been going to and fro, but what's he been doing to and fro? Wreaking havoc on Job. Satan knows what he's been doing. God knows what Satan has been doing. And Satan knows that God knows what Satan has been doing. So all of a sudden, these questions become really loaded. Where have you been? And what does Satan answer? Oh, just walking. No big deal. Just doing nothing. To and fro on the earth. Just chilling. And everyone knows what actually has been happening. Satan, at every invitation to respond to God's overtures, is just moving further and further away into nothingness and evil. right? He could have responded in a different kind of way and taken some sort of step towards God, or at least not a step further away from him. But he chooses evasion. He chooses, subtlety. Well, he can't say that I'm lying. I have been to and fro, after all, right? These questions, these similarities are repeated in order to highlight for us the difference in knowledge that we have now, right? Like, God knows what Satan has been up to, and yet Satan doesn't answer that way. And so Satan, and again, God now tells us about Job's character again. Job is someone who's blameless and upright, who fears God and shuns evil. That's 3 times now we've heard this about Job. The very first verse, and God himself has now said it twice. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. Okay. So, we'll just keep going. What do we do with verse 3? We hold it in our hopper for a while. That's what we're going to do with it. And so then Satan says, tell you what, just let me pressure his body, right? Let me take away his health, and he's going to curse you to your face. Again, this is not the original deal. This is not the original wager. Job's already past that. Again, it's like Satan is lashing out, looking for any reason, any hope to undermine and to doubt God and to doubt Job. And he says, let me change the terms. And the Lord says to Satan, very well, he's in your hands, but you must spare his life. It's like the little cube. He's like, all right, the chaos can even go inside this cube, but you gotta keep his life. You can't kill him. Okay. So sometimes we'll ask the question, why is this second trial so much harder, seemingly harder for Job? I mean, he's already lost all of his wealth and all of his kids. For us, and then it's like he gets these really bad boils, right? Let's even call him the worst case of chicken pox in history. But who of us would say, yeah, the chicken pox, that's what's going to break me. Not losing my 10 kids. The chicken pox is really the final straw, right? Not really any of us. For most of us, losing the family would be the hardest trial, seemingly hardest trial that Job would have to go through. And so it seems like what's happening here is that it is the combination and the building up of the disasters that fall on Job that's just so difficult. It's the loss of wealth, the loss of family, the loss of his social standing, the loss of his sleep. He'll even say that he's tormented day and night, and he's unable to sleep. And during the day, he longs for the night. And at night, he longs for the day because he's tormented. He just can't sleep. And so there's a sense in which the mental and psychological and personal trials are just ratcheted up on this second round where his body is cursed and tormented. Okay. Any questions about the heaven scene? I think it's neat the way the author repeats everything, and you're like, oh, but you're repeating it, but you mean something different by it when you repeat it the second time, and you mean for me to know that I know that you know that this is meaningfully different. And then there's the differences, and you go, you mean for me to look at them and go, wait a minute, this little bit is extra. That's important. That's just some of the tricks that the Bible writers use. All right, so now we get to Job's wife. So throughout church history, she is normally pilloried? I don't even know the right word. I mean, just absolutely lambasted for being a terrible, terrible person. Some people even called this like the third trial. Job went through 2 cycles, and then his third trial was his wife turning on him. That she is in line with Satan has been some of the language that's been used, that she is an ally of Satan in Job's case, in the trial against Job. So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that she does some things wrong. So what is it that she does wrong? Yeah, she says, curse God and die, which again, we're supposed to go, oh, I remember this cursing God language. That's exactly what the Satan wanted Job to do. So she says, are you still maintaining your integrity? We'll come back to that one in a couple weeks. Okay, so curse God and die. So yeah, how is her response to Job understandable? If we were going to say, it's not right, but I get it, how would we do it? Deb? That's exactly right. She's lost her family. She's lost her livelihood. She's seeing her husband suffer unimaginable loss, physical loss. And it brings us to our knees, right? And to our ends. And it is very understandable that in the face of such crippling loss, that her response is, there can't be a God in all of this. Just curse him and die. And in some sense, she's wanting for Job the end of all of his sufferings, right? She doesn't deny God's existence. She doesn't even deny God's power, right? She just, in a sense, she says, I want you to curse God, and then he'll kill you. Meaning, I know God exists. I know he's all-powerful. In some sense, I understand that he's in charge, and that if you curse him, he's likely going to get so mad at you, he'll just kill you dead. She actually has a fair bit of knowledge and even some kind of faith, but it's a faith that's in extreme crisis and breaks under this extreme duress. So what should we do with Job's wife? What do we do with her? What's your response and reaction to her? Yeah. Yeah. Satan wants women to look bad. Yeah, that's right. Like, I think I tend to pity her. You know, I want that to be my first response, and there is a sense in which Job's righteousness is brighter against the reaction of a normal person. Like, we go, oh, how dare she? You're like, I'd have been right there with her. You know, let's be honest, most of us would have been right there with her. It's almost like, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but like in the Olympics, I always think it'd be really neat if whenever they're doing, I always feel bad for those countries that look like they're really slow, because on the world stage, they're nowhere near the fastest in the world. You know, you've got like Botswana doing the swimming, and you're like, man, that looks really slow. You're like half a lap behind. But what I would love to do is to have someone like me out there who's comparing, right? Like, all right, this is just your average guy from the gym, and he's going to also do the 300 meters. All of a sudden, Botswana looks a lot faster, right? I think she is kind of like just the average person example. She is you and me and the normal person's response in this crisis. And so we should pity her. And in some sense, I think there's a hint that she too is restored at the end of the book. She's never mentioned, but we do get the words that Job has his sons and daughters, 7 sons and 3 daughters again at the end of the story. And that to me implies that everything again is right in Job's life, including his relationship with his wife. So I don't want to condemn her, even though we do want to critique her. And of course, Job does the same thing. He says, you know, you speak like one of the foolish women. He doesn't call her a fool. He doesn't even say you are a foolish woman. He says you're talking like a foolish woman, which gives Job, you know, a little bit of wiggle room later on whenever she says, you called me a fool. I didn't call you a fool. I said you were like a fool. No. Okay, so that brings us to where we'll stop for next week. The second scene, or with the friends coming. Oh, no, it doesn't. We're going to end with verse 10. Job did not sin in what he said. We'll do that next week. Oh, that's a fun one. So here's the question. It seems like a repetition, but go back and compare it to 122. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. That's 122. Now let's look at 2:10. In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. we ask ourselves, there's repetition here, but there's a difference. Why is there a difference? Why in this second time does it focus and say that Job did not sin in what he said, but in 122 it says Job did not sin at all by charging God with wrongdoing? Fascinating. That's going to be our quiz for next class.